What's up, Packer fans? Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. A couple main topics that I want to get to today, including MVS and a potential contract extension. Very interesting article over on Cheesehead TV this past week that discussed a potential extension for MVS, which I do think is a really interesting topic. So I want to get to that in just a moment. Before I do so, I wanted to talk a little bit about this defense and Joe Barry and how they looked at OTAs and minicamp, because it's one of the kind of forgotten storylines this offseason, it feels like, with all the Aaron Rodgers conversation, with everyone keeping eyes on Jordan Love during minicamps and OTAs, with everyone wanting to get a glance at the rookies. And I know some people have been kind of talking about the star position, but overall, this new defense, this new defensive coordinator has sort of flown under the radar. So I want to take some time to just kind of go over my observations on Joe Barry so far and kind of go over how this defense has looked at these practices. So first of all, the biggest thing that has stood out to me with Joe Barry is his hands-on approach. He feels much more engaged, involved, hands-on than what Mike Pettine did. That's not a shot at Mike Pettine. It's just a difference in philosophy, right? So you can see him kind of walking through the field, hands-on players, like kind of, getting up there, showing them how to do things. A lot of, pats on the butt for a good job, like just very involved in everything. He's moving all around. He's talking to all different players on defense, kind of going through some philosophical approaches, walking them through how to do things. Just a very hands-on coach. And I think it was in a way just a welcome change. You could see that he was getting involved more in the day-to-day, more in the minutia, and you could see the players reacting to that coaching. He's making contact with each individual players, which I'm sure helps him gain buy-in with each of those players with how he wants to run his defense. At the same token, he has no issue getting in your face if you're doing something wrong. I mentioned this story earlier in the offseason at rookie minicamp where a defensive lineman, they were going through a drill and they were trying to, just go through the offensive lineman and get to the quarterback and make a play on the quarterback. There wasn't actually a quarterback there, but the coach who was playing quarterback in that situation. And your goal is to get through the offensive lineman, finish, and I think strip the ball out or at least get hands on the quarterback. And this defensive lineman, I honestly forget which one it was, but defensive lineman gets through the line of scrimmage and, had struggled to get through the offensive lineman. The offensive lineman easily won the rep. And while he was going back, he just kind of started heading back rather than finishing things out. And Barry got after him immediately, coaching him on being in good habits and getting his hands on the quarterback no matter what. And, got after him immediately. It was, it was a stark difference than obviously his normal demeanor, just kind of easygoing and, complimenting everybody. But that's an important trait to have. It was something when Matt LaFleur came in where I wanted to see, because he always felt like a little bit more of a player's coach, right? But it is such an insanely fine line between being a player's coach and getting after a player when you really need to get after them because they didn't do something that you were supposed to, or getting after the team when they didn't do something that they were supposed to. And if you don't do both of those things, you can end up in a very poor position. If you're just constantly getting after players, but not offering praise and not being a little bit more of a player's coach, you can have problems. If you're too much of a player's coach, then players will walk all over you and there's no, really captain, rearing the ship, if you will. Or steering the ship. So in my opinion, Matt LaFleur has done a masterful job of that. And I've really liked what I've seen out of Joe Barry as well, where again, he's walking that line of kind of being a player's coach, hands-on, hey, I'm your buddy, but hey, if you don't do what you're supposed to, I will get in your face and I will tell you about it in front of everyone. And overall, I've liked how he's handled things and I've liked how his coaching approach has been, especially if you're a rookie defensive lineman. You want to know what you did wrong and you don't mind some harsh coaching, so you're making sure you do it right the next time. So again, he's somebody that's going to smile and tell you, you're doing a good job more often than not. But if you're not, he's going to rip you a new one. And again, I think that's overall a solid approach, and I like how he's handled things so far. He's also been incredibly genuine with the media, both in person as well as in press conferences. Even just he came to the sideline the other day. I think he was just getting some tape to wrap something. I don't even know what he was getting. But just, very casual with the media on the sideline saying, hey, how are you doing? Like, it's noticeable. Does this matter? Does this matter for how he's going to coach the defense, or if they're going to be a top 10 defense or anything like that? No, it doesn't matter. But at the same token, you start cheering for that type of player, that type of coach that, kind of cares how everyone's doing. And he just genuinely seems like a nice guy out there on the field, again, until you screw something up, in which he'll get in your face and he'll tell you about it. I like that as a coach. So I've liked his approach so far. As far as, more importantly, how the defense has looked out on the field, I feel like you can see more communication with the players. I feel like players are communicating a little bit more on the field, and I think that's obviously a really good sign. I wasn't at as many practices during this time period last year, so it could be that there was just as much communication, and I certainly just didn't see it, but I could see a concerted effort by this defense to be extra communicative to make sure that they're consistently on the same page. Overall, from a defensive standpoint, it looks very similar in nature. A lot of zone defense, a lot of bend but don't break, playing kind of an umbrella style defense, making sure that you're not able to get deep plays down the field. You're keeping everything in front of you. You have the opportunity to get your hands on the ball. You're trying to make the quarterback check the ball down, and you're making them go the length of the field. You've seen a lot of that with Mike Pettine last year. You've seen a lot of it so far on defense with the Green Bay Packers. You've seen players line up primarily in a lot of the same spots that they lined up under Mike Pettine. You don't see, we're not talking today about, oh, this person's lined up in a completely different position than they've ever played before. We just haven't seen any of that. Shannon Sullivan's in the slot. Jair's outside. Kevin King's outside. Josh Jackson is outside. Eric Stokes is outside. Savage is at safety. Amos is at safety with a caveat that I'll get to in a moment. Will Redmond's at safety. Chris Barnes is at linebacker. Ty Summers is at linebacker on the inside. You see some Kamal Martin there. All the defensive linemen are up front. The edge rushers are on the edge. It looks like a normal nickel style defense, very similar to what Mike Pettine was running for the most part a season ago. So I think in a way, and Aaron Nagler and I talked about this on Let's Talk Packers for Cheesehead TV this past week, I think in a way that's going to make it easier for this defense to transition from Mike Pettine to Joe Barry in year one, which sometimes can be a little bit challenging because remember, all the rest of the coaching staff on defense is primarily the same. So they've got a lot of the same coaches, almost entirely the same personnel, save for Devondre Campbell instead of Christian Kirksey. Eric Stokes will get some playing time, I'm sure. Maybe Shamar Jean-Charles, maybe TJ Slayton. But for the most part, this defense is almost an apples to apples carbon copy from a coaching staff and from a personnel standpoint of what they were a season ago, except for Joe Barry. So I think they're going to be able to carry some things over. I think it's almost similar to what we saw in the first year of Matt LaFleur, right, where they were running some concepts from Mike McCarthy and Aaron Rodgers that they still felt comfortable with while also integrating Matt LaFleur's style and system. I think you could see a lot of the same with Joe Barry this year, where they still have a lot of the same players and a lot of the same concepts, and maybe they're going to carry over a little bit of that Mike Pettine stuff, but at the same time, you're going to see an infusion of what Joe Barry wants to do as well. And we all talked about, myself included, how Jordan Love was checking the ball down a ton at his first few practices, and it looked a little bit disjointed. And practices against each other is always a little bit disjointed, right? Because on the one hand, you want to see Jordan Love rip the ball downfield and do something awesome, but in this situation you get to celebrate the defense at the same time, and I don't feel like we did that. Now if Jordan Love's ripping the defense apart and you're like, oh great, Jordan Love looks great, but now it's like, all right, is the defense not looking so great? So there's always like a give and take here in these situations. But with Jordan Love and how he was checking things down in those first handful of practices, at the same time we need to recognize what the defense was doing. Like, they were forcing the ball to be checked down on a lot of those situations. I'm sure, listen, I know Jordan Love is young, right? But I'm sure if he goes to his first read or his second read on a play and they're open, it's not like he's just going to sit with the ball and twiddle his thumbs, right? He's smart. He's a quarterback, right? That you see somebody open, you throw the dang ball. So give credit to this Joe Barry defense for how they've looked. And Matt LaFleur mentioned as well, usually in non-padded practices and at this point of the season, the defense is a little bit ahead of the offense. But this offense, for the most part, is players who have all been here and know the Matt LaFleur system. The defense have players that have been here but are still learning a new system. So the fact that they've been able to kind of do what this defense is set to do, force all those checkdowns, that's got to be a good sign for the defense, whether it's Jordan Love or Blake Bortles, Kurt Benkert, Aaron Rodgers. It doesn't matter. If your defense is getting checkdowns, they're doing their job for the most part. So tip your cap and say that, hey, while it may be a little bit of a struggle for Jordan Love, it's also complimentary of what the Packers are trying to accomplish on defense. And again, I think overall we saw a lot of zone defense, a lot of everything, players playing back, eyes on the football, trying to keep everything in front of them, which is exactly what we expected. It seems to be coming along very well. And I think the other note that I wanted to make here is it seems like Adrian Amos is going to be a player that they could move around some and could make all of this work. Whether he's playing at safety, we saw him some at the nickel linebacker position, we saw him some in the slot. it seems like Amos is a player that Joe Barry and this defense has identified is maybe taking on a little bit of a bigger role. So that's going to be a player that I'm really keeping my eye on in training camp. And Adrian Amos just could be the player that kind of brings this defense all together, at least in this first year under Joe Barry. So really excited. I think Amos is a tremendous football player, and I think he can do anything that you ask of him on defense. So I'm really excited to see how that comes to fruition, and I really like him in that nickel linebacker spot if that's what they decide to go with. Now, if that means more Will Redmond at safety, we're going to have to maybe have a conversation. We'll see how Redmond can kind of hold up there, but overall, it definitely seems like they have a pretty big role for Adrian Amos in mind as this defense transitions forward under Joe Barry. All right, last but not least, wanted to get to my MVS discussion. And again, this was an article on Cheesehead TV by Mark Oldacres, which is a fantastic last name, by the way. And he talked about a potential MVS extension and why it makes sense to do it now and maybe not wait until the season is over. Now, I think this is a really interesting discussion because, first of all, the only way that I see this really working is if you talk to MVS and he's willing to take a discount now to maybe, get a long-term deal, make sure he gets some money, make sure that if he has a bad season this year or gets injured, that he's still getting a pretty decent payday. If MVS is of that mindset, then I say, okay, if you can get him on a 3-year, even $15 million deal, maybe that seems rich, but I think $5 million per year is fairly fair for what, or what he's done up until this point. If they can get him on something like that or even cheaper and they make that deal or make that offer and he says, yeah, all right, I can definitely see that happening. But unless you can get him on the cheap, I don't think it makes sense for Green Bay to do this sort of, to do this sort of move right now. On the flip side, if I were MVS, I would more be willing to bet on myself and say, hey, I'm going to go and have a big season and make bank in the offseason next year. Listen, teams are always looking for deep threats. Look at what Will Fuller got just this offseason. $10.5 million on a 1-year deal for Will Fuller. $10.5 million on a 1-year deal. Like, that is big time. If MVS can show that he is a consistent deep threat and have a similar season to what Will Fuller had a season ago, maybe he doesn't get 10.5, but he'll get a payday. And he's still young. He's still super talented. So if he goes out and has a monster year, he will get very much paid. So in a way, and if you kind of look at it this way too, Green Bay doesn't have a ton of salary cap flexibility, both now or next year either. So to give him a bigger contract now really hurts you this season with how they're trying to kind of put together this roster this season. It really hurts you next season as you're trying to figure out that as well. So it's just really tough to put a value on MVS that makes sense really for either side right now. Because again, if I'm MVS, I'm betting on myself. If I'm the Packers, any sort of deal that I try to do probably doesn't make a ton of sense. So in a way, I almost view this as a same situation as Kevin King was in a season ago as he was going into the last year of his deal. Obviously, Kevin King had a lot of inconsistencies, showed upside, showed promise, also had some frustrating moments. This was prior to last season. And you wondered how 2020 would work out and how he could possibly come back. And how I always viewed Kevin King in 2020 is that, listen, if he played amazing in 2020 and Kevin King had an all-time year and looked fantastic, there's no way Green Bay would have been able to afford him. So he would have played himself out of Green Bay and some team would have given him number one corner money and paid him a huge deal. If he was awful a season ago, played the season and was completely just terrible, then Green Bay says, we're not interested anymore. We're going to go in a different direction. The only way that Kevin King comes back is if he has a middling sort of season, shows those same ups that he always had, shows those same downs that he always had, misses some time with injury, and there's not a huge demand on him for the market, and you probably have more value for him in Green Bay because he knows your system than any other team does. And while I think they overpaid him, that's exactly what ended up happening. They viewed him higher than teams around the NFL did. He knows the system. He's a good locker room guy, all of those things. So they bring him back and say, hey, we'll give you a 1-year deal, and we'll see if you can kind of finally have that breakout season. And that's what happened with Kevin King. And I think with MVS, he's in the same situation that Kevin King was a season ago. If he goes out and he has a superstar sort of year and has his finally has his breakout season, Green Bay's not going to be able to afford him unless they let Davante Adams walk. I guess who knows anymore. But unless they let Adams walk, I can't imagine that they would afford him and make him number one wide receiver and pay him number one wide receiver money. If he has a terrible season and continues to show, and all of a sudden the drops and all those sort of stuff, are more prevalent than even they were a season ago, and he's not making the big plays, and it just seems like, all right, he's never going to get it, then Green Bay probably says, I'm sorry, we're going to go in a different direction. maybe very similarly to Kevin King, if he's just the same MVS as he's been the last few seasons, he's going to rip your heart out a few times. He's going to make some of the most spectacular plays a few times. You just don't ever know what you're going to get. He's the ultimate wild card on the team. And other teams say like, hey, we're not going to pay big money for that type of player. And, he has more value in Green Bay than anywhere else. Maybe similarly to Kevin King, they find a 1-year deal on a number that makes sense for both sides. But I think it makes it really difficult to come to a number right now with either MVS or the Packers to try to find a middle ground and make that deal work. And maybe if they signed him to a long-term deal, they could save a little bit money this season. But he's only making $2 million this season, which I think is fair market value for MVS at his point in his career right now. And again, I just think it makes sense for both sides to play out the season and see where he's at, unless MVS is willing to take a massively discounted deal, which I wouldn't hope for him, and I don't think that that's the right move for him. So we'll see. Maybe as the season goes further along or as they get to the end of the season, it's a little bit more clear and they can make something work. But as of right now, I think it's really difficult to make it happen. And even if I were Green Bay, if I were choosing to prioritize a contract on offense right now, I would prioritize Robert Tonyan over MVS at the moment. That's not a slight to MVS. I think MVS should be in that conversation, but I really think that Tonyan would be the one that I'd be prioritizing if I were Green Bay before he goes out and has potentially another great season, and now his contract is exorbitant. So that would be the contract that I'd be looking at. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you as always for listening. I greatly appreciate it. You guys are absolutely amazing. I'll be right back here tomorrow, but until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.